Hello and welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers. With me as ever, delighted to have Tom Slater, editor of Spiked, with us. And an extra special guest, Zoe Strimpel, historian, author and Sunday Telegraph columnist. Welcome, Zoe.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on. We've got loads to talk about today, from the woes of the Labour government to the war in Lebanon and whether a rapist should be allowed to identify as a woman. But before all of that, Tom, you've got an exciting announcement to make.
Absolutely. So as anyone who saw the podcast last week will already know, we've just released our latest Spiked book, Brendan O'Neill's After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization. So you can go and get it on Amazon now. But most importantly, if you want a signed copy of the book signed by Brendan himself, we're giving those away exclusively to anyone who donates £50 or more to Spiked while stocks last. So to do so, just go to spiked-online.com/donate to get your copy. And we'll also throw in a year's membership to Spiked supporters as well. So yes, After the Pogrom, get it on Amazon, or if you want a signed copy, go to spiked-online.com/donate.
So we had the Labour conference this week. It should have been a victory lap. This was the first Labour conference with a Labour government in 14 years, with a Labour Prime Minister addressing the room. But there was just this inescapable feeling that everything has gone wrong very quickly. Tom, what did you make of it this week?
No, it was a fascinatingly damp mood. And of course, the main story here is Freebies Gate and that continuing to dog the party. It's been one scandal after another. I mean, everyone has heard about the glasses and the suits and the thousands of pounds that has been spent by Lord Ali, this Labour lord, on Keir Starmer's attire, his wife's attire, Angela Rayner's attire, Angela Rayner's holidays. This week we found out that he also gave the Starmers kind of lend of his Covent Garden pad, multi-million pound pad, so that during the general election campaign, Starmer's son could study. Most recently, we've also heard about this broadcast that Starmer put out in the tail end of 2021, the kind of Omicron wave of COVID, where he essentially tried to dress it up as if it was his own home to urge people to stay at home, even though it was Lord Ali's very plush apartment. So it hasn't really stopped. A lot of these arguments are pretty well aerated by now, but I think they're still true, which is to say this is very much the Labour Party being caught by their own sort of moralism. Yeah. They have engaged in this sort of politics of like pearl clutching where the Tories were concerned, partly with COVID, but with other issues as well. They felt most comfortable just running against them by the idea that they were sort of grubby, corrupt, didn't follow the rules. And now as a consequence of that, now that they've been seen to be engaging in some of the same grubby tactics, been seen to be bending some of the same rules, it doesn't matter what the letter of the law is in relation to donations and how they're declared. I think it's just kind of reminded people, or at least reinforced the kind of sense that despite what Labour and the kind of anti-Tory media have tried to suggest for the past few years, these parties, these political parties, when it comes to things like this, are not really that different. Yeah. And I think for many people, it's been a reminder of that, I suppose.
Yeah. So what have you?
Well, I was just going to dive in to say it's worse when Labour does it. And I wouldn't say it's, all political parties do it. It's worse when Labour does it precisely because partly of the pearl clutching when the shoe was on the other foot. As a side note, I think this is worse than Partygate. I was quite pro-lockdown, et cetera, but this is, for reasons I can go into later, worse. That actually relate to my point now, which is that if your whole thing is rooted in a kind of quasi crypto, not even crypto, just socialist kind of politics, right? So you genuinely despise the trappings of wealth. You despise the concept of wealth in as much as it's unequal and accrues more and more to the people who have it. Even though that's a ridiculous idea, it's not a zero-sum game. People can be stinking rich and poor people can also become more rich. It's not one or the other. Anyway, if your whole politics and your political career and convictions are rooted in that belief that sort of markets and capitalism and inequality, whatever that means, is the kind of thing that the human endeavor should be dedicated to wiping out and changing, to then hypocrisy is one word, but it's craven, it's embarrassing, and it's just so inconsistent. Whereas at least if you're a big like banker Thatcherite, it's not inconsistent to be greedy and want to go to like be in a 9 million pound Covent Garden pad, or to take all these trappings that only are possible because of the work of people like bankers. Not that bankers are so, I'm not saying bankers are great, but the economy that produces this level of wealth is to do with finance. And so I find it like how can they not just stop and think, okay, that whole part of my politics is that, but when it applies to me, it is actually quite nice to have such lovely things. So that just galls me so much.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, sorry, final thing, funnily enough, of all of this, one of the things that bugged me the most was Victoria Starmer at the Taylor Swift, because does she really need a free ticket to a Taylor Swift concert when we all know how badly girls, young women love and identify with Taylor Swift? We know how many people are struggling financially. We know that it's not that easy. You have to have a lot of money and a lot of know-how to get a Taylor Swift ticket. Really? She felt that she was the right recipient? I mean, it's such a no-brainer. She should have said, oh, I've, got this free ticket. I'm going to give it away to a local girl who blah, 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 blah. I mean, it's just...
Yeah, because some of the freebies you could say are defensible, and if Keir Starmer were better at politics, he would have defended himself better. I mean, he eventually came around to making the argument that his safety would be compromised if he wasn't in the box at the Arsenal, things like that. You could say that, of course, politicians have to look good on the global stage, and especially, women get looked at, judged for how they dress. I mean, I don't buy into these arguments, but you could certainly make them for some of these things. But with Taylor Swift tickets, there's no justification whatsoever.
I don't think they can make the arguments. I don't think any of those arguments hang together, because there's always a counter argument that would be truer to their politics. And this is the one place where Jeremy Corbyn, who I obviously despise on very, very many deep levels, was at least... He didn't fall into this. Jeremy Corbyn was not caught in any trappings of luxury ever. He was through and through the man who ate beans and was like horrendously kind of smelly looking and boring, despite having a house in Islington or whatever. But horrible though as Jeremy Corbyn is, that's the kind of thing politicians. That was actually probably his strongest suit. Yeah. I don't think they can defend. I mean, if everyone else, if they are literally the party of the proletariat and they're the party of the people, and the people are getting by with, figuring out how the people have to look good too. They have to do it for Marks and Spencer,
and they have to pay for their own clothes out of their wages,
and they have to study in places wherever they whatever is available, and also okay, you can go to an Arsenal, but there's such thing as a personal protection, which he should have as a prime minister.
Yeah,
but I don't think you need to look like you are dressed in $1 million to be a fitting first lady
and seeing them on television, you're not 100% sure where the money's going as well. It's not like they're dazzling when Keir Starmer appears on the news. In a way, I think this is a reminder that the Labour Party, to the extent that it might occasionally have this kind of workerist pose, or it might have this kind of moralising posture towards capitalism or the Tories or whatever. This has been a useful reminder, I think, probably for young people in particular, that certainly since the new Labour years, it has basically been the sort of party of like liberal elite spivs. It's the sort of thing where they will try to present themselves as kind of much more moral, kind of like Amnesty, the parliamentary wing of Amnesty International in a way. But it's not that kind of red in tooth and claw socialism, but nor is it the moral claims that they make for themselves in a more kind of centrist, acceptable sort of garb. But I think that's one of the things that came out in the deflections in all of the media interviews, was there was a kind of sense of, well, it's different because we're the good people. They were taking various kinds of gifts, and they were hobnobbing with various rich people, but they were bad people, so it's a slightly different proposition. That felt like it was the sort of implication. I guess it's been interesting to see a lot of kind of anti-Brexit people, or sort of originally kind of Starmer outriders, were kind of really shocked that things like not just this, but like winter fuel payments being rescinded has happened. And you think, do you not realise that this is what the Labour Party generally is when it actually manages to get in power? It's not necessarily this haloed party that is often presented as.
Yeah, and do you think, Zoe, I mean, the fact that the government seems pretty directionless as well, that's one of the other big criticisms. Even some Starmer fans have started calling out the void at the heart of this government. That might also be why these criticisms have had more bite, because if they had a bit of direction, if you felt that there was a political project that the public could get behind, then maybe these accusations would bounce off a little bit.
I think it's just a charisma vacuum, which I don't think charisma is a substitute for policy. But he's said pylons and prisons and hideous houses in beautiful places. So basically making Britain as ugly as humanly possible for the sake of wider goods, arguably. Okay, that's pretty much seems to be the policy. Take some, make it harder to inherit wealth, make life harder for rich people, make it harder for property owners, be anti-landlord, do everything in your power to create a brain drain and send anyone with money rushing out of this country as fast as possible. That seems to be, but that's not a very fun Even for people who sign up to that, it's kind of a bit dreary. So it's a bit like, oh, well, at least now we can add some life to this, because they just seem so, they're kind of this very unattractive combination of like dreary, boring, wealth killing, nice things, anti-nice things, but then they have their own issues with, hypocrisy there. And then, so, but there is maybe policy there, but it's just so, where can you get excited in any of it? And but this is carrying on a tradition from the previous governments, which is just this is like ban crazy Britain. Like, how should we rule? We'll rule by banning this, banning that, doing that unpleasant thing, curbing that, clamping down on that. And instead of just Liz Truss was the only person who was a disaster. And I actually, I don't think Liz Truss was good at all in her role as Prime Minister. And it's unfortunate that it was in the person of Liz Truss that we had our only articulation of like dynamism, economic dynamism. And so these guys, it's like, oh, well, this is, at least now we have a freebie scandal. We can start to these people's kind of cravenness can kind of come into focus, seeing as their policies are so hard to kind of, I think there are policies, but they're great, pylons.
One person who's a figure of fun, even if he doesn't intend to be, is David Lammy. Tom, I don't know if you saw him at the UN this week giving a rousing speech against Russia, saying while he sat there that he stood there as a black man. And that's meant that he understood the war in Ukraine better than anyone else. What did you make of that?
I thought that was a interesting moment, one in a long line of gaffes from Lammy, not as bad as some of the other ones we've seen recently. Certainly not him causing a kind of mini international incident with his slightly ill-advised blog post about Nagorno-Karabakh. But yes, I thought it was interesting because there was this attempt to really shift the focus away from party conference, which was a bit damp and was surrounded by all of these non-scandals, which have taken on a much bigger significance because of the void at the heart of this government. But
also because it's just so tempting when
absolutely
proletariat types
you can't help
want a bit of luxury.
Absolutely, which is nothing wrong with that, but certainly wasn't the way they present themselves. Exactly. And it was interesting, this speech as well, because first of all, it's a reminder that surely David Lammy is not long for that job. I mean, he's made an absolutely terrible go of it. He looks like a bit of a deer in the headlights. He's like he's trying to do his best impression of a foreign secretary and sort of failing miserably. In this particular speech, denouncing Russia, particularly the Russian representative who was there, saying that he was on his phone while he was speaking and trying to denounce Putin's invasion of Ukraine by likening it to his own family story, his own family's experience of colonialism and imperialism as the descendant of slaves and so on. But it really did just come off as I think Maddie Grant from The Telegraph summed it up quite nicely. Well, enough about those Ukrainians. Let's talk about me for a second. That is kind of what it felt like. So even when it comes to kind of identitarian grandstanding, which unfortunately does take an outsized role in our politics these days, even when you're in the UN or in the House of Commons, he can't even do that right. Yeah, it seems like. Bless him.
This episode is sponsored by Shopify. Does it sometimes feel like everyone else around you is starting their own business and leaving you behind? Have you got an idea for a project, but you don't know where to start? Luckily, you can get some help along the way, and it sounds like this. Yes, that's the sound of another sale on Shopify. Shopify is the all-in-one commerce platform that helps you start and run your very own business. Whether you're selling vintage posters or ceramic coasters, Shopify helps all kinds of entrepreneurs set up and manage their shop. Its simple dashboard and shop-ready point-of-sale system make managing orders and payments incredibly easy. And thanks to its 24/7 support and Shopify's huge business course library, you'll have everything you need to get off the ground. There's a reason why Shopify has already helped millions of businesses like yours. Its industry-leading tools can help you expand your business without you having to learn design coding skills. Shopify also helps you cover all sales channels from Facebook to TikTok. So whether you want your business to go global or stay local, Shopify gives you the freedom to go your own way. It's time to get serious about selling. Set up your Shopify today. Sign up for a £1 per month trial period at shopify.co.uk/spiked, all lowercase. Just go to shopify.co.uk/spiked to take your business to the next level. That's shopify.co.uk/spiked. I do want to talk a bit about international politics, what's going on in Israel and Lebanon. I mean, things might have changed radically by the time people are watching this, but when we're recording this, Israel's bombardment has intensified and they've rebuffed calls for a ceasefire. Now, Zoe, if you're listening to any Western world leaders or you're watching the Western media, you could possibly have no idea why any of this is going on. You could think that you'd think that Israel is just bombing Lebanon for the sake of it because it's fun or something like that.
Well, I'll refine why you'd think they're bombing for the sake of it. It's because they're blood-sucking Jews. That's why you think that. That's why one would think, based on unfortunately, kind of mainstream Western media, which I like in many other regards. The idea that has run through every defensive campaign that Israel has done, which is all of them. Israel doesn't start wars unless it's facing existential threats or just threats that are unacceptable to any country. The running theme is always, and the way it's pitched in myriad subtle ways, turns of phrases, respectable kind of hedges and false equivalences, is those Israelis firstly, it's always killing all these children, which is just an anti-Semitic blood libel, because the IDF goes absolutely out of its way to not kill children. And if children very tragically die, it is entirely, in the case of Gaza anyway, because Hamas very happy to make them be civilian shields, because they know exactly how the world will react. So their plan works perfectly every time. I find it kind of, it's just extraordinary. And it's not even like a sort of low key misunderstanding in areas of the press. It is something that people who have no skin in the game whatsoever will get so passionate about. I've had very intense, kind of almost like hand-to-hand combat of words with editors about me saying, no, Israel didn't start this. Israel has tens of thousands of people who cannot go back to their homes in the north. That's unacceptable. The rockets that have come from Hezbollah. The refusal of Hezbollah to get behind the Litani River, which was a UN-decided thing. They have refused. They've thumbed their nose at it. They hide Hezbollah in residential houses. It's like Gaza Redux, and even worse, because we now are seeing like the footage of tunnels that Hezbollah have done. And yet the pitch is, Israel's just randomly going in because they love to kill children.
Yeah. And, as you're saying that, this has been going on since at least October the 8th, this particular round.
The Lebanese bomb. They know exactly what they're doing. They know. They all know. They're smart. Hezbollah and Hamas and Iran, they all know. Do that, provoke Israel, force Israel to react. The world goes into a frenzy. It doesn't even care about Ukraine anymore. This is the only thing it cares about. Certainly doesn't care about the Uyghurs, doesn't care about any much more kind of problematic.
And certainly, although they claim to, groups like Hezbollah and certainly not Hamas don't really care about Palestinians. They will fight Israel to the last Palestinian, it seems.
Well, that's what they share as well. I mean, that's the thing that holds this kind of loose association, this particular alliance between Hezbollah, which is obviously a Shia militia, and Hamas, who are Sunni descendants of the Muslim Brotherhood, effectively. There's a lot they don't agree on. They're on different sides of the Syrian civil war, for instance, but fundamentally it's the loathing of Israel, the desire to destroy it, not simply to push it back out of its territories as they might want to present it sometimes. And it's one of those things of incredibly short memories where any of this is concerned. So as you say, everyone forgets the fact that as of October the 8th, in solidarity with the pogromists of Hamas, you have Hezbollah raining down missiles on the north of Israel. It's also lack of short memories in terms of how the Lebanon war ended in 2006 with the UN resolution, as you say. Hezbollah are all parties agreeing that they were going to pull back behind that Litani River 20 miles north of the border or so. And whilst Israel had up their end of the bargain, Hezbollah did not hold up their end of the bargain. They ended up actually building their forces more significantly, staying in that area. And this, therefore, as a consequence of those two things, this day was always going to come. I think the difficulty, aside from the Israelophobia, anti-Semitism, the double standards that we've already talked about, I think there's also a bit of a component of the fact that I think people who live in the West, who have the supreme privilege of not having war on their near border, and also who have had the kind of recent experiences of, to the extent that we have been involved in wars, they've often been these kind of foreign misadventures that have ended terribly badly. It's bred amongst some people this kind of assumption that almost like war in all circumstances is horrible, and it was just in why would it ever take place? Whereas if you just give to them the sort of example, like if there was a particularly strident set of Scottish nationalists who were raining down missiles on Carlisle from the Scottish borders, the idea that the British state would do nothing about that and wouldn't try and put a stop to it is obviously insane. But for a mix of, I suppose, presentism, bit of naivety, and also a heavy dose of anti-Israel bigotry that slips in, they cannot really grasp as to why Israel would even have an interest in trying to push back this near and present threat?
I don't know. There's probably legal restrictions on saying it, but you can cut this. But I'll just say it anyway, which is that it's not anti-Israel prejudice or it's just anti-Semitism. That's why
it's fine if we're not talking
can't.
about anyone in particular.
Yeah.
So
No,
you can
Okay,
legally, you're absolutely fine.
the world. It's not the first time that anti-Semitic currents and tropes have structured discourse and understandings, and that's why it's that explains all of the ways in which it's presented. And it's what's so extraordinary is that it's not, as I say, it's not a minor thing. It's something that a lot of people who have nothing to do with it get hugely passionate about.
Yeah, and the debate is being had in bad faith as well, of course, because in Israel there are very passionate debates, particularly around Gaza, about should they prioritize the hostages, should they prioritize eliminating Hamas. Not necessarily convinced that those two are in tension, but there you go. People are having debates about that. Whereas in the West, the assumption is that actually, well, it should just be Israel that ceases fire. The other sides, we don't really care what they get.
But they don't care because, again, I know I keep coming back to it, but they don't care because they don't really care. They just care that it's a chance the philosophy of anti-Semitism known as the pattern, which David Deutsch, who's a physicist, coined, but it's the legitimizing of the harming of Jews, right? So that is the kind of, it's not hatred of Jews because they meet a Jew and they probably wouldn't hate them, but it's that urge to legitimize. And this is a key way of doing it. But I was just quickly coming back to that really good point you made about sort of not understanding that war involves some like nasty things and a winning side and a losing side and a just side often, and a kind of someone who started it, and the kind of war shyness and the sort of confusion about categories, like people who die in the field of war, that's not murder, like unless it is a war crime of the type that, well, we know that the Americans did occasionally in Iraq, and the British soldiers have been responsible for occasionally, but mostly being done by in Syria and Iraq and by these terror groups. But people just can't. There's a dishonesty there. They really don't want to distinguish and say it's a war. Israel's waging a war. There are civilian shields or whatever. Hezbollah has provoked a war. War has this. It's not a question of A, murder, and B, soldiers who sign up to war. Like there's a risk of dying in war. And it's like that seems to, as you say, the luxury of the decadence of our position it's really worrying, because when a war really does come to our doorstep, which it will, if Russia continues in the way it is, if China continues various things, we won't have a clue. It's over. I can't see us winning any kind of war that ends up on our doorstep.
Someone, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think it's one of those things where, for whatever reason, apart from the people who are just sort of lost to anti-Semitism and so on, where this particular conflict is concerned, I think there is also, they've just been fed a very black and white narrative, and it would be more damnable on their part if it wasn't being repeated by the BBC, if it wasn't being repeated by all of the mainstream news outlets, which is almost to present, of course, war is hell. Like no one wants war, no one wants conflict, no one should luxuriate in it by any stretch of the imagination.
Particularly civilian casualties.
Absolutely, which are unfortunate, but a feature of every conflict ever. They've been fed this incredibly simplistic narrative.
Well, it's simplistic, sort of, but it's not being fed. Again, you're absconding them from responsibility. Everyone has the ability to Google stuff. Everyone can find out what they want to find out. They are choosing the narratives that I don't buy. I've never bought the argument that they're just being fed misinformation. They are choosing those. There's a reason that half the people go pro, not half, a tiny proportion go pro-Israel. The other, and the others don't. So I do think, and I think it doesn't help that it's completely reprehensible that the likes of the BBC just quote, according to the Hamas health ministry. Why would you take a sadistic Islamist theocratic kind of like totalitarian regime's word for their numbers of casualties? But the whole Western media does that. It's insane to me.
I suppose what I'm getting at is, for whatever reason, the way in which the debate has been framed, even amongst supposedly respectable outlets, is like, you're not in favour of war, are you? You're not in favour of killing children, are you? And that's kind of the terms in which it's been presented. That shouldn't take any responsibility off of anyone for actually doing some actual research and thinking. And all of the videos that we've seen of people being asked to name the river and the sea in question in that particular chant on those demonstrations tells you everything you need to know about the level of ignorance amongst the very impassioned people who are suddenly very pro Hamas in
Probably
necessary.
activist
It's still an
teaching
issue.
doesn't help. Probably a lot of them are young and they're going to schools where the teachers are now kind of sneaking in sort of quite problematic
Certainly
woke
seems that way.
histories.
So let's move on to talk about Scotland for a bit. It's unbelievable this has to be said, but Scotland's top police officer has announced that if you are a male rapist, you will no longer be allowed to self-identify as a woman as regards to the police. So until now, there was a policy of essentially self-ID. If you said you were female, the police officers would treat you as female for all intents and purposes. This obviously relates to the even more serious scandal of trans women rapists being placed in female prisons in Scotland until that was put a stop to. I mean, Zoe, are we finally seeing some common sense? I mean, even the fact that we have to, make this move is still shocking to me.
It's so embarrassing that while Russia and China and Iran are busy kind of cooking up the end of the world, the West has literally got its knickers in a twist about, who's a girl and who's a boy and what private parts mean and so embarrassing. It's so, as you say, cringe. I mean, is the tide turning? I mean, I've written the odd thing about how, J.K. Rowling has moved the needle in various ways, and certain kind of things suggest not only, the cast report, but many other things that maybe the tide is turning. I don't think the tide is turning because I think it's too late. The ship has sailed for the tide turning. The damage has gone. The toxin has spread. I mean, I think when you talk to sort of Gen Z or whatever, it's gone in so deep that they now repeat, they parrot that, gender is purely a construct and sex is a construct. And so I don't know. I have to say, I think that, yes, it's good that in some, maybe, governments, Scotland law, is starting to reflect some semblance of going back to kind of just basic epistemological norms.
Yeah.
But I think by now, but we live in, the cultural damage, has been done.
Yeah, Tom.
I think it's a reminder as well that, because I think we've all been struck by how as soon as you feel like you've pushed it down in one institution, it pops back off in another, or you feel like there's a particular win. The Cass review felt like that for a lot of people, not least because this Labour government have at least kind of rhetorically backed its recommendations, whilst in other policies it's pursuing things like the conversion therapy bill and so on.
Yeah.
Going back on that to a certain extent, but it's a bit like, the kind of Ibram X. Kendi thing. It's not enough to be not racist; you have to be actively anti-racist. I feel like it's not enough for institutions now to just not be lost to gender ideology. They've really got to be actively trying to push it out of the processes, of the way in which these things have gone, and not in a kind of purge-like fashion, but just to say we need to return to just objective reality, biological facts. That's not a big ask of an institution like the prison service or the health service or the legal profession. That surely should be fundamental. Those things surely should be fundamental to all of them. But I think there's been this kind of sense that it would, collapse under the weight of scrutiny, collapse under the weight of people realizing what was going on, and also collapse under the weight of its own ridiculousness, gender ideology, that is. And I think we're starting to find that whilst there are moments like this, as we've seen with Police Scotland, encouraging signs that people are beginning to twig. Even the police chief saying something quite explicitly, only men commit this crime. Yeah. Which is something that you could imagine them trying to hedge in a really embarrassing fashion even a few years ago, that there's much more to be done still.
What's the latest on Starmer's circumlocutions around this issue? Does he still say
is he still on 99.9% of penises?
I think he says, I think the last time he was asked about it, he says, well, I've always said that sex is biological. But that doesn't quite answer.
He didn't.
First of all, he didn't, because we've had the 99.9% of women don't have penises.
My favourite one was when it was during the election campaign, and they would say to him, is a woman an adult human female? And he just said, I agree with Tony Blair. That's all he could bring himself to say. He couldn't say yes. He couldn't say I agree with Rosie Duffield. Obviously, he couldn't say I agree. It's almost like deference to Tony Blair is one line that he's always willing to stake out, but beyond that, he's still
actually that's probably the best thing about speaking as a Blairite. That's the one thing I can probably respect.
There you go.
And it's funny, but as Tom said, they are accepting the Cass review. Even the SNP have actually accepted the Cass review, and it's only some of the nuttier fringes that are really trying to push back on that. There's been a big hoo-ha in the British Medical Association over it. Lots of activists trying to discredit it, but generally, the good news is that I have some faith that when the facts are laid out in front of people, they think, oh God, that's a bit of a mistake. But also, as you said, so, so much of the damage has been done, whether that's in, the women who have been raped in prisons, whether that's the children who have been mutilated as a result of thinking of all this, and the younger generation who still unfortunately cling to this belief.
Well, I think it's just that by now, maybe even in Scotland, some people's children have started to say they want to transition and bind their breasts, and the parents are suddenly starting to realize how awful and insane so much of this is. That isn't the few instances of genuine gender dysphoria, which we know is like a known disorder. Which is, should be treated through being trans or whatever. But this idea that, we know now, thanks to people like Abigail Schreier and stuff, that this is a social contagion largely. Yeah. So maybe it's reached the kids of the lawmakers. I don't know.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.